Hey guys, tonight we're diving into forgotten secrets of the Sumerian temple prostitutes. And no, it's not cute. It's weird, it's wild, and you probably wouldn't last 10 minutes without crying or getting fined in barley. Imagine the worst group project you've ever had, but it's an entire civilization. The project is inventing cities, and everyone communicates by poking wet clay with a stick. You're trudging through streets that are 50% mud, 30% donkey droppings, and 20% existential dread. A guy is yelling about the price of sesame oil, a goat is trying to eat your tunic, and you haven't seen a toilet in, well, ever. You think you could handle it? Yeah, me neither. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is, because my sleep schedule is a myth and I like knowing I'm not alone in the void. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. The sun is a merciless, white-hot dinner plate in a bleached-out sky. You've been walking for days, and your feet feel like two bruised avocados someone left in a hot car. The landscape is flat, brown, and aggressively dull, crisscrossed by irrigation canals that shimmer with questionable water. But it's the smell that hits you first. It's a complex, room-clearing perfume with top notes of goat, heart notes of fermenting grain and human sweat, and a base note of, well, let's call it organic waste management. This is the signature scent of civilization. Baby. Welcome to the outskirts of Uruk, circa 3200 BCE. You crest a low, dusty ridge, and there it is, the city, and it breaks your brain. You were expecting a village, maybe a slightly bigger one, with a fence. This is not a village. This is a sprawling, chaotic organism of mud brick, stretching for miles. Enormous walls, studded with defensive towers, rise from the plain like the serrated spine of some mythological beast. This isn't just a wall to keep out a few bandits. This is a statement. This is the world's first and most significant, "You are not on the guest list" sign. And it's a mainstream historical fact that Uruk was one of humanity's first ever megacities. A bustling metropolis when London was still a swampy marsh ideal for losing a welly. You shuffle along with a river of other travelers, farmers hauling produce, merchants with weary-looking donkeys, pilgrims with that slightly too intense look in their eyes. The noise grows from a hum to a roar. It's the sound of 10,000 people all trying to invent society at the same time, very loudly. You pass through a massive city gate, and the sensory assault kicks into overdrive. The street, if you can call it that, is a narrow, churning canyon of humanity. There are no sidewalks. There is no personal space. You're elbow to elbow with people whose personal hygiene standards are, let's say, pre-soap. A stray dog with a suspicious limp gives you the side eye. A child, caked in so much dust they look like a tiny clay statue, tries to sell you a desiccated lizard on a string. It's the world's first urban experience, and it has all the charm of a modern music festival on day 3, but with more dysentery. Your sandals make a horrifying sticky sound with every step. You don't look down. It's better not to know. You focus on not getting trampled by a cart laden with massive pottery jars or a self-important looking guy in a fringed skirt who is clearly late for a meeting about quarterly barley reports. As you stumble through the maze of alleyways, you start to notice something weird. Everywhere, literally everywhere, are piles of ugly, crudely made clay bowls. They're stacked in corners, tossed in middens, and crunched into shards underfoot. They all have the same sad, lopsided shape with beveled rims. These are the infamous beveled rim bowls, the disposable coffee cups of ancient Mesopotamia. This is a quirky little tidbit of archaeology. These things are so everyday that they're a hallmark of this entire period. They're the Uruk period's pumpkin spice latte. Now, you'd think a simple bowl is a simple bowl, but oh no. Historians still argue whether these were standardized ration containers for state laborers building the temples, functioning like ancient paychecks made of carbs, or single-use offering bowls for the gods, because apparently the deities were germaphobes. Other scholars, probably after their third glass of wine at a conference, suggest they were just molds for baking bread. Academics will literally get into Twitter flame wars over the purpose of ancient, disposable Tupperware. It's a beautiful thing. All you know is they make the ground an uneven, crunchy nightmare to walk on. You dodge a woman balancing a basket of squawking ducks on her head and nearly trip into a gutter flowing with something you decide is just city juice. Above the squat, windowless mud brick houses of the common folk, you see it, your destination. Rising from the heart of the city is a complex of buildings so vast and monumental that it feels alien. Brightly colored clay cones arranged in mosaic patterns glitter on the temple walls. And towering over it all is a massive, stepped pyramid, an artificial mountain reaching for the heavens, the great ziggurat of Uruk, dedicated to the sky god Anu. But you're not here for him. You're headed for the other side of the holy district, the Inanna precinct, the house of the goddess of love, war, and getting what she wants. The goddess Inanna. You can almost feel the energy buzzing from it. A weird mix of profound holiness and something that feels suspiciously like a board meeting for a Fortune 500 company. The air changes here. It smells less like goats and more like incense, baking bread, and crushing bureaucracy. You've made it to the edge of the sacred zone, and you have a sinking feeling that the outside world, with its lizard-selling children and sticky floors, was the standard part. You've reached the main gate of the Inanna precinct, and it makes the city gate look like a cheap doggy door. Two colossal towers of mud brick flank an opening so tall you could march a whole squadron of giants through it. The doors themselves are made from entire cedar trees, imported from mountains you've only heard of in myths, and banded with copper that glints menacingly in the sun. This isn't just a door. It's an emotional and spiritual filtration system with the patience of a toddler who missed their nap. And guarding it are the temple bouncers. They're not muscle-bound guys in tight shirts. They're lean, stern-faced men in clean linen kilts, holding bronze-tipped spears. Their eyes are cold and flat, like they've seen every possible excuse, lie, and half-baked blessing you could ever invent, and they are not impressed. One of them steps forward, blocking your path. He's not physically imposing, but he radiates an aura of bureaucratic fatigue that is far more terrifying than any muscle. He's the beta test version of a TSA agent, the original DMV employee, and he has a clay tablet and a stylus tucked into his belt like a sidearm. He looks you up and down, and you can feel his gaze catalog every smudge of dirt, every frayed thread on your tunic, and the undeniable fact that you smell faintly of terrified donkey. This is your first and most crucial hurdle, the purity check. It's a mainstream historical fact that Mesopotamian temples were not come-as-you-are community centers. They were the houses of the gods, and you couldn't just track your mortal filth into a deity's living room. Ritual purity was paramount. State your purpose and your offering, the guard says, his voice as dry as a week-old barley cake. You stammer something about seeking the blessing of the great goddess Inanna. You hold out your offering. A small, slightly squashed loaf of bread you've been guarding with your life for 2 days. The guard stares at the bread. The bread visibly shrinks under his contemptuous gaze. He doesn't even look at you. He seems through you, as if calculating the precise level of spiritual contamination you represent. Have you had contact with the dead in the last 3 days? He intones. No. With a woman during her monthly courses? No. With a pig. You hesitate. Did that one that snuffled at your sandal back in the market count as contact? No. He leans in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that smells faintly of onions and piety. You're caked in the dust of the profane world. Your shadow is probably unclean. The goddess cannot be approached by this. He gestures vaguely at your entire existence. You are a walking biohazard. He explains that to enter, you must first be cleansed. This involves a dunk in a basin of holy but murky water near the gate and, more importantly, a more substantial donation to cover the spiritual inconvenience you've caused. Your sad little loaf of bread isn't going to cut it. It's a divine cover charge and you're short on cash. You're starting to sweat. This is less a spiritual journey and more a shakedown. As you fumble in your pouch for a few small bits of silver you were hoping to use for, food, the guard taps the massive brick wall of the gate tower with the butt of his spear. The sound is a dull, final thud. This temple is strong, he says, a flicker of something that might be a smile on his face. It's built on a foundation of devotion. Every king who builds a new wall or temple buries sacred pegs in the foundation. little copper figures of himself carrying a brick, dedicating it all to the goddess. This is a quirky little archaeological fact. These foundation deposits are real little time capsules of royal piety. But the way he says it doesn't sound like a fun history lesson. They anchor the sacred to the earth. He continues, his eyes boring into yours. We take the sanctity of this place very, very seriously. It's best not to become a permanent part of the foundation, if you know what I mean. You're pretty sure you do. You hastily produce the silver. It vanishes into his hand. He nods, satisfied that your spiritual ledger is now slightly less pathetic. As another priest waves you through the initial checkpoint, you see other hopefuls getting the same treatment. A wealthy-looking merchant in a colorful robe gets waved through with a deferential bow after handing over a whole goat. A poor farmer and his wife are turned away entirely, their small basket of dates deemed insufficient. It's a mess of arbitrary rules and on-the-spot judgments. And here, historians still argue whether the great temple complexes were truly the heart of the community, open to all who were pure of heart, or if they were exclusive clubs for the 1%, where divine favor was directly proportional to your net worth. Was it a sacred space for the public, or a gated community for the gods and their rich friends? Looking at the farmer shuffling away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, you think the answer is a grim and resounding yes. The debate feels absurd when you're watching a holy bouncer decide who is worthy based on the quality of their livestock. You're finally allowed to step past the outer gate into the first great courtyard. The noise of the city drops away, replaced by a low, humming reverence. The air is thick with the sweet, heavy smell of cedar incense. The sheer scale of the place is dizzying. You're standing in a vast open space paved with baked bricks, surrounded by towering walls decorated with those hypnotic clay cone mosaics. It's a kaleidoscope of red, black, and white geometric patterns that seem to shift and buzz in the heat. It's designed to make you feel small, insignificant, and thoroughly vetted. You've made it past security. You've paid the price, both in silver and in dignity. But as you look deeper into the complex, towards the nested courtyards and the shadowy doorways leading to the inner sanctum, you realize getting in the door was the easy part. You are now officially on God turf, and you have no idea what the rules are. You follow a stream of robed figures and temple workers deeper into the Inanna precinct. It's a city within a city, a labyrinth of courtyards, workshops, and storehouses that sprawls over an area that would make a modern shopping mall feel quaint. This isn't just a place of worship. You realize with dawning horror that you've wandered into the divine equivalent of a corporate headquarters combined with an Amazon fulfillment center. The entire operation runs on an obsessive-compulsive level of organization that would make a German engineer weep with joy. This is Inanna's holy gigafactory, and business is booming. Everywhere you look, there's industry. In one courtyard, dozens of women sit in long rows, grinding barley on stone querns. The air is hazy with flour dust and the rhythmic, hypnotic scrape of stone on stone. This isn't for a small community bake sale. They are producing flour on an industrial scale. A mainstream historical fact is that Sumerian temples were massive economic engines. They were the largest landowners, the biggest employers, and the central hubs for the production and redistribution of goods. They were, in essence, the state. You shuffle past them, trying not to inhale too much of the holy gluten, and stumble into another courtyard. This one smells yeasty and amazing. Huge clay vats, some as tall as you are, line the walls. Men with long wooden paddles are stirring a thick, bubbling mash. They're brewing beer, gallons upon gallons of it. Temple beer wasn't just for a good time after a long day of appeasing the gods. It was a staple of the Sumerian diet and, more importantly, a form of payment. Temple laborers, priests, and even the highest officials received their wages in rations of barley and beer. You're literally looking at barrels of liquid salary. It's also thick, gritty, and probably tastes like fermented bread soup, so maybe don't quit your day job. As you navigate this divine industrial park, you notice that everything is being watched. Scribes are everywhere. They perch on low stools and shady corners, their faces masks of intense concentration, their hands a blur as they press reed styluses into damp clay tablets. Scribes are recording the amount of grain coming in from the temple's estates. Scribes tallying the number of sheep being brought for sacrifice. Scribes are noting down how many jars of beer have been distributed. One particularly severe-looking scribe is counting loom weights in a weaving workshop, his lips moving silently. It's a bureaucracy of terrifying efficiency. They invented writing not for poetry or epic love stories, but for accounting. The world's first literature was a spreadsheet. Specifically, it was a receipt for barley. You see a group of temple workers unloading sacks of grain from a boat that's just arrived via one of the city's canals, which runs right up to the temple walls. A scribe with a clipboard, well, a clayboard, is checking off each sack. He argues with the boatman, pointing emphatically at a line of cuneiform on his tablet. The boatman throws his hands up in exasperation. You are witnessing the world's first shipping and receiving dispute. This is where you encounter a really quirky tidbit. As you peer over the scribe's shoulder, you see that the symbols aren't just pictures of barley stalks and jars. They're abstract wedges and lines. But you also see small circular and semicircular impressions. These are the numeral systems. And for a long time, archaeologists were baffled by thousands of tiny, uninscribed clay balls, cones, and discs found all over these sites. They looked like ancient game pieces. Turns out they were tokens, physical representations of goods. One cone might mean a small measure of grain, a sphere a considerable measure, a disc a flock of sheep. Before writing was fully developed, this was how they did their bookkeeping. They'd seal these tokens inside a big clay ball, called a bulla, to create a tamper-proof record of a transaction. The guy on the receiving end would break the bulla and check that the tokens inside matched the goods he received. Eventually, some genius scribe got tired of making and breaking clay balls and just decided to press the tokens onto the outside of the ball to show what was inside. And then another genius realized they could draw pictures of the tokens on a flat piece of clay and skip the ball altogether. You are looking at the birth of abstract data visualization. They literally tokenized their assets. Of course, the whole system created its own set of problems. Historians still argue whether this hyper-organized temple economy was a benevolent socialist utopia, providing for everyone from the king to the lowest canal digger, or a rigid, coercive system of state control that bordered on slavery. Were the people who worked these temple lands devout followers contributing to the common good? Or were they serfs tied to the land, their lives dictated by the quotas on a scribe's clay tablet? The truth is probably a messy, uncomfortable both. It was a system that could feed thousands during a famine but could also fine you into oblivion for misplacing a single sheep. It was a divine social safety net and a soul-crushing bureaucracy all at once. You feel a growing sense of unease. This isn't a place of quiet contemplation. It's loud, it's busy, and it reeks of production quotas. The sacred and the profane aren't just mingling here. They're co-CEOs of the same multinational corporation. You wanted to find the heart of Sumerian spirituality, but so far all you've found is the divine department of motor vehicles. You see a doorway, more ornate than the others, leading out of the brewery courtyard. Statues of roaring, lion-headed eagles flank it. It looks important. It seems like it might lead somewhere that doesn't involve inventory management. Hoping to finally find the actual temple part of this temple factory, you slip through, leaving the sounds of industry and accounting behind. You step through the ornate doorway and the world shifts. The air cools. The chaotic noise of the workshops fades into a reverent hush, giving way to the faint echo of chanting and the soft, rhythmic clatter of loom shuttles. You're in a cloistered inner courtyard, a sanctuary reserved for the temple's elite. The walls here are smoother, the mosaics more intricate. A small, carefully tended garden in the center offers a patch of impossible green, a relief from the endless beige of the city. This is the domain of the priestesses, and they are not what you expected. You see them moving through the colonnades, their bare feet silent on the stone floors. They wear robes of bleached white linen, so fine it's almost translucent. Their long, dark hair elaborately braided and pinned with ornaments of gold and lapis lazuli. Their eyes are lined with black coal, giving them a gaze at once ancient and unervingly direct. They don't look like cloistered nuns or quiet spiritual recluses. They look like CEOs, diplomats, and senior management of a very, very old and powerful institution. And you, a dusty, bewildered tourist who just blundered into the executive wing, feel about as welcome as a raccoon at a board meeting. A mainstream historical fact about ancient Mesopotamia is that women, particularly those in the priesthood, could wield significant social and economic power. High priestesses, known as Entu, were often daughters of kings, appointed to their roles to solidify political alliances between the crown and the temple. They weren't just spiritual leaders. They were major landowners, they managed vast estates, and they could enter into contracts and run businesses in their own right. The most famous of all, Inanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, is the world's first known author by name. She was a poet, a political powerhouse, and a high priestess to the moon god Nanna. The women you're looking at are her spiritual and professional ancestors. You watch as two of them confer over a clay tablet, their conversation a low, severe murmur. One points to a line of cuneiform, her finger tracing the wedges, and the other nods, making a sharp, decisive gesture. They're not discussing prayer schedules. They're reviewing a legal contract or a shipment manifest. They radiate competence. One of them looks up, and her eyes meet yours. It's not a hostile look, just an appraising one. It says, "You are not authorized to be here." You try to look as harmless and spiritually pure as possible, which is difficult when you're still mentally calculating how much beer salary you'd need to survive a week in Uruk. As you shrink back into a shadowy alcove, you overhear a different group. These women are younger, novices perhaps. They are practicing a hymn, their voices rising and falling in a strange, hypnotic cadence. Their teacher, an older priestess with silver threads in her hair, corrects their pitch with a quiet word. But these aren't just any women. And this is where the popular image of temple prostitutes comes from, and where it gets complicated and weird. Our understanding of these roles is a linguistic and cultural minefield. There were many different classes of temple women, each with its own title, such as Nadatu, Kadishtu, and Ishtaratu. For centuries, translators, usually Victorian men who clutched their pearls at the very thought of sex and religion occupying the same sentence, took these titles and slapped the label prostitute on them. The word Kadishtu literally translates to Holy One or Consecrated One. But because some of these women were associated with the temple of Inanna or Ishtar, her Akkadian equivalent, the goddess of love and sensuality, they just assumed the holiness must be horizontal. This brings us to a quirky fringe tidbit that's now gaining more mainstream acceptance. Many of these so-called sacred prostitutes may not have been involved in sexual rites at all. The Nadatu women, for example, lived in a kind of monastery, were often celibate, and functioned as scribes and business agents. They were sacred, yes, but more like divine real estate agents than anything else. Their vows prevented them from having children who could inherit and break up the family estate, which made them the perfect, sterile conduits for passing wealth down through a male lineage. Romance wasn't just dead. It was a bad business strategy. So what were they doing? Well, that's the million-dollar question. Historians still argue whether the concept of sacred prostitution, as a widespread, institutionalized practice, ever truly existed in Sumer. Was it a genuine religious rite, a symbolic act reenacting the goddess's sacred power of creation and fertility? Or was it just a slanderous rumor, a misunderstanding spread by later cultures? Looking at you, ancient Greeks, who were both horrified and fascinated by the idea of women holding spiritual authority. Or, and this is the most likely and most complicated answer, was it something else entirely that we don't have the right words or concepts for? The debate is a scholarly cage match. One side points to texts that seem to describe sexual rites, while the other side argues those texts are metaphorical, poetic descriptions of the goddess's power, not literal job descriptions for her priestesses. Mocking the debate is easy because either way, the reality was probably stranger than our modern categories can handle. They weren't simply prostitutes, but they also weren't nuns. They were something in between, a third thing our vocabulary fails to capture. You look back at the priestesses. Their faces are serene, focused, powerful. To call them prostitutes feels like calling a neurosurgeon a bone poker. It's a comically inadequate and insulting oversimplification. These women are managing a massive spiritual and economic enterprise. They are poets, musicians, brewers, weavers, accountants, and lawyers, all in service to a goddess who embodies the most chaotic and powerful forces of life. Their connection to her is one of profound devotion, but it is also a job, a very, very demanding one with a confusingly spicy, surprisingly corporate job description. One of the novices catches you staring again and gives you a small, enigmatic smile before turning back to her chanting. It's a smile that says, "You have absolutely no idea what's going on here, do you?" And she is 100% correct. You're still lurking in the priestess's courtyard, trying to be as inconspicuous as a ghost at a family reunion, when a procession starts to form. This isn't the usual temple hustle and bustle. This is different. There's an electric tension in the air, a sense of choreographed anticipation. Priests in elaborate feathered headdresses emerge from a side chamber, carrying standards topped with the symbols of Inanna, the 8-pointed star and the hooked doorpost. Musicians appear with lyres, drums, and sistrums, those ancient rattles that make a sound like 1,000 tiny, angry snakes. The priestesses you saw earlier are now forming a formal line, their white robes a stark contrast to the colorful banners and gleaming instruments. You've stumbled into the pre-show for something big. A low, deep hum begins as the priests start a guttural chant. The sound vibrates in your chest, making your teeth ache. Then, through a grand archway at the far end of the courtyard, he appears. The king. He's not just a king. He's the priest king of Uruk. He's decked out in a floor-length, fringed robe, a golden circlet on his head, and a ceremonial beard that looks so perfectly sculpted it might be fake. He moves with a slow, deliberate gravity, his face a mask of solemn importance. You can tell this is his big day. He looks like a groom on his wedding day, if his wedding were also a performance review with God, with the entire country watching. He's here for the main event, the sacred marriage rite or Hieros Gamos. This is the Super Bowl of Sumerian religious festivals, and it's a mainstream historical fact that this ritual was a cornerstone of Mesopotamian kingship for thousands of years. The ceremony was a symbolic and possibly literal union between the king and the goddess Inanna, represented by her high priestess. The whole point was to ensure the fertility of the land, the prosperity of the people, and the continued stability of the cosmos. No pressure, though, just the fate of civilization resting on your performance. The king is led to a specially prepared chamber, the Ganun, which has been decked out like the world's most opulent honeymoon suite. The texts describe it in lush detail. A bed carved from precious wood, spread with fine linens and fleece, and scented with cedar and sweet herbs. The king enters, and the high priestess, now embodying the goddess herself, is waiting for him. The doors are closed. The chanting outside swells. The drums beat a steady, heart-like rhythm. And you, the uninvited guest, are left in the courtyard with everyone else, staring at a closed door and using your imagination. And this is where things get awkward. The poems and hymns that describe the sacred marriage are some of the oldest love poetry in the world. They are incredibly beautiful, surprisingly explicit, and read like the liner notes to a Marvin Gaye album written 4,000 years ago. The priestess, as Inanna, sings of her beauty, her power, her desire for the king, whom she calls Demused, her beloved shepherd. He, in turn, praises her, promising her gifts and eternal devotion. It's all very romantic and cosmic. But then you remember, this is a state-mandated religious duty. This is the king's most awkward divine date. Imagine trying to perform the act of cosmic creation, knowing that a bunch of priests are right outside, taking notes and judging your divine stamina. It's a truly quirky tidbit that some of the hymns for this ceremony were written in a specific dialect called Amizal, or fine speech, which was almost exclusively used by female speakers, or when quoting female deities. It was a language of intimacy and power, reserved for the goddess and her priestesses, giving them a unique voice in the heart of the most critical state ritual. It's as if the spiritual climax of the year had to be spoken in a language only the goddess and her earthly representatives truly commanded. But what actually happened behind that closed door? This is one of the most oversized and heated scholarly debates in the field. Historians still argue whether the sacred marriage rite was a literal, physical act between the king and the priestess, or a purely symbolic and metaphorical piece of religious theater. Did they actually do it? Some scholars, pointing to the very sensual language of the poems, insist it was real. They argue that the physical union was essential to activate the land's fertility magically. It was sympathetic magic on a grand national scale. If the king and the goddess get busy, the barley and the sheep will follow suit. Other scholars find this idea a bit too literal, a bit too HBO. They argue that the poems were allegorical, that the bed was the temple itself, and the union was a symbolic fusion of divine and earthly power, perhaps sealed with a feast or some other non-sexual ritual act. They suggest that to think they were literally having sex is to impose our modern, debased views on a sophisticated and abstract religious concept. The debate gets surprisingly personal, with each side accusing the other of being either a repressed prude or a sensationalist pervert. It's the ultimate academic soap opera. As the ziggurat turns, you're standing there in the courtyard, listening to the drums, and you can see why the debate rages on. The whole thing feels both profoundly sacred and profoundly weird. The fate of the crops, the herds, and the people all depends on a divine hookup that may or may not be happening 20 feet away from you. The music reaches a crescendo. A great cheer goes up from the assembled priests. The doors to the chamber swing open. The king and the high priestess emerge, looking serene and divinely refreshed. A feast is declared. The beer flows. The land is officially fertile for another year. The king seems relieved, like he's just passed the most stressful final exam of his life. And you feel like you've accidentally crashed the weirdest, most high-stakes wedding reception in human history. Alright, so you've just witnessed the cosmic union that keeps Sumerian civilization from collapsing into a pile of infertile dust. You're feeling pretty initiated, maybe even a little worldly. You've seen the inner workings of the Temple Corporation, met the powerful priestess executives, and crashed a divine wedding. You think you've got a handle on this whole sacred sexuality thing. And then, about 2,500 years later, a Greek guy with a flair for the dramatic and a casual relationship with the truth shows up, takes one look at this complex tapestry of ritual, power, and economics, and writes the ancient world's most infamous and misleading Yelp review. His name is Herodotus. He's often called the father of history, but he could just as easily be called the father of making stuff up for clicks. In the 5th century BCE, long after the Sumerian temples had crumbled, he traveled to Babylon, the cultural heir to Sumer, and wrote about a practice that would forever tarnish the reputation of Mesopotamian religion. You can almost picture him, a tourist in a funny hat, getting all his information from a cynical tour guide who's just trying to get a big tip by spinning the most salacious tales. According to Herodotus, and this is a mainstream historical fact in that he actually wrote it and everyone believed it for centuries, every single Babylonian woman, regardless of her social status, was required by law to go to the temple of Ishtar, the goddess he calls Melita, once in her lifetime and sit there. She had to sit in the temple courtyard and wait until a strange man came by, threw a silver coin in her lap, and said the words, "I demand you in the name of the goddess Melita." She was then religiously obligated to go with that man and have sex with him outside the temple grounds. It didn't matter if she was rich or poor, beautiful or not so beautiful. She couldn't refuse the first man who chose her, and she couldn't go home until she had fulfilled her duty. The silver coin was then dedicated to the goddess. Let's pause and absorb the sheer chaotic energy of this story. Herodotus paints a picture of the temple precinct as a divine meat market, a place of sacred, compulsory one-night stands. He describes the beautiful women getting picked quickly, while the less fortunate ones, he snidely remarks, might have to wait for years, growing old in the temple courtyards. It's a story that is equal parts horrifying, sad, and frankly, logistically impossible. Imagine the lines, the awkward small talk, the sheer administrative nightmare of tracking which citizens had completed their mandatory holy hookup. It sounds less like a religious rite and more like a divinely ordained public health crisis. For 2 millennia, this single passage from Herodotus became the definitive source on sacred prostitution in Mesopotamia. It was juicy, it was scandalous, and it confirmed every negative stereotype later cultures wanted to believe about the decadent East. It was repeated as fact by Roman authors, Christian church fathers, and Enlightenment scholars. It was the historical equivalent of a viral TikTok rumor that refuses to die. But here's the quirky, or rather infuriating tidbit. There is not a single shred of cuneiform evidence from Mesopotamia itself to support Herodotus's wild tale. Zero. Zilch. Nada. For a civilization that wrote down literally everything. Every last goat, every jar of beer, every legal dispute over a broken fence. The complete absence of any mention of this universal, compulsory religious duty is deafening. There are no law codes that mention it. No temple administrative texts that budget for it. No personal letters complaining about it. Dearest Mum, still waiting at the temple. The snacks are terrible. Send more silver for the cute guy from Kish. Nothing. This has led to one of the most brutal and long-running debates in ancient history. Historians still argue whether Herodotus was recording a genuine, albeit bizarre, local custom that left no written trace, or if he was completely and utterly full of it. Was he a careful ethnographer reporting on a real practice, however strange it seems to us? Or was he a gullible tourist duped by local folklore, a propagandist trying to make the Persians, who ruled Babylon at the time, look weird and immoral, or just a fantastic storyteller who knew a spicy anecdote would make his book sell? Scholars who defend him suggest the practice might have been a much older, distorted memory of something real, perhaps a ritual tied to hospitality or a rite of passage that he misinterpreted through his own Greek cultural lens. Those who call shenanigans, and their numbers are growing, point out that Herodotus's story fits a common Greek literary trope: the look at these crazy barbarian customs narrative. He was writing for a Greek audience, and nothing makes you feel better about your own culture than hearing about how another culture is way weirder. It's the ancient equivalent of watching a reality TV show about hoarders to make you feel better about the pile of laundry on your floor. Mocking this debate is almost too easy. It's a 2,500-year-old argument based entirely on the testimony of one guy who also reported seeing giant, gold-digging ants in India. Maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't take everything he said at face value. So you, standing in the very real, very bureaucratic temple of Inanna, are now caught in the crossfire of history. The reality you're witnessing is one of powerful women, complex economics, and solemn state rituals. It's a world of order, piety, and a truly terrifying amount of paperwork. But thanks to one Greek historian with a bestseller to write, this entire institution will be remembered by the rest of the world as a place of mandatory, joyless sex with strangers. It's the ultimate historical character assassination. The complex, powerful priestess of Inanna is about to be flattened into the one-dimensional, tragic figure of the temple prostitute, a label that will stick to her for the next 2,500 years, all because one guy heard a wild story and decided it was too good to fact-check. You decide to back away slowly from the sacred marriage after-party before anyone notices you don't have the proper security clearance. You wander away from the central ceremonial courts and find yourself in what feels like the temple's financial district. The vibe here is less spiritual ecstasy and more quarterly earnings report. You're in the treasury and the central storehouses, the beating economic heart of Inanna's divine corporation. And let me tell you, the goddess is not just rich. She's Bezos level, Scrooge McDuck swimming in a vault of gold rich. You pass storerooms stacked to the ceiling with goods. One room is filled with enormous pottery jars containing olive oil, wine, a luxury import, and honey, each sealed with a clay stopper stamped with a temple official seal. It's the ancient equivalent of tamper-proof packaging. Another room is a fragrant treasure cave of spices and incense, the air thick with the scent of cedar, myrrh, and juniper. You see a chamber filled with bolts of brightly colored wool and linen, woven in the temple workshops. This isn't just surplus. This is wealth. This is capital. This is the temple flexing its economic muscle. It's a mainstream historical fact that the great temple complexes were the most prominent financial institutions of their time, functioning as banks, production centers, and redistribution hubs that controlled vast agricultural lands and commanded large numbers of laborers. Priests with the perpetually stressed look of accountants are directing workers as they unload carts. Everything is being counted, weighed, and recorded. A scribe is meticulously noting the weight of a basket of lapis lazuli, a brilliant blue stone imported from the mountains of Afghanistan. Another is inventorying copper ingots from Anatolia. This temple doesn't just run on local barley. It's a major player in international trade. The gods had an insatiable appetite for luxury goods, and the temple had the economic clout to acquire them. They were the original multinational corporation, and their business was holiness. As you peek into one of the more heavily guarded storerooms, you see something that glitters. It's not just raw materials. You see finished goods, golden goblets, ornate furniture inlaid with shell and carnelian, and ceremonial weapons that look far too pretty ever to be used in an actual fight. These are the goddess's assets, but they're also the state treasury. The line between church and state is not just blurry here, it's non-existent. The temple is the state, and the state is the temple. And here's a fun little bonus fact. The temple was essentially a tax-exempt entity that also happened to be the primary tax collector. The king might be the CEO, but the gods were the majority shareholders, and they did not pay taxes. Instead, they received them in the form of offerings, tithes, and the produce from the vast estates they owned. This leads you to a wonderfully quirky tidbit about their accounting practices. You see a scribe making a tally on a large, sectioned clay tablet. Next to the cuneiform symbols for sheep and barley, he's also making notations for things that seem less tangible. He's recording a divine blessing bestowed upon a local merchant in exchange for a hefty donation of silver. He's noting down the favorable omen promised to a general before a battle, a service for which the temple received 10 prime quality goats. They were literally monetizing miracles. The temple's books weren't just balancing assets and liabilities. They were balancing material goods with divine favor. You are looking at the invention of spiritual accounting, where a prayer has a measurable market value and a good harvest is a return on investment. Of course, this concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a priestly class raises some serious questions. Historians still debate whether the temple economy was a stabilizing force that ensured the community's survival or an exploitative system designed to enrich a small clerical elite. Was this a divinely mandated welfare state, a god's granary that stored surplus to feed the people in times of famine? Or was it a religious racket, where the fear of divine wrath was used to extract every last bit of wealth from a superstitious populace? The answer, as always, is probably a depressing mix of both. The same institution that could organize massive irrigation projects to prevent starvation could also foreclose on a farmer's land if he failed to deliver his divinely mandated barley tithe. They were the providers and the predators, all rolled into one holy bureaucratic package. You watch a farmer approach one of the temple administrators, his shoulders slumped. He holds his clay receipt in his hand, pointing at the numbers, his expression pleading. He clearly thinks he's been shortchanged on his barley ration. The administrator, a man whose face looks carved from granite, then tells a very disappointing joke, shakes his head, taps the tablet with his stylus, and dismisses the farmer with a flick of his wrist. The cuneiform has spoken. The ledger is final. There is no divine customer service line to appeal to. The farmer shuffles away, defeated by a spreadsheet. The system is brutal, efficient, and utterly impersonal. It runs on beer, blessings, and bookkeeping, and if you fall on the wrong side of the ledger, the gods themselves can't save you. The smell of incense in the air suddenly seems less like an offering to the heavens and more like the air freshener they use in a bank to cover up the smell of desperation. You've had enough of divine economics for one day. Your brain hurts from trying to calculate piety to profit ratios, and you desperately need to see something that doesn't involve a clay tablet. You slip out of the temple's administrative wing and find yourself in a quieter, more contemplative area. It seems to be a school or a library. Priests and scribes are seated in a courtyard, copying texts as their styluses move in a silent, hypnotic dance. One older priest is telling a story to a group of young novices, his voice a low, captivating hum. You creep closer, hiding behind a pillar that smells faintly of pigeon, and begin to listen. He's not reciting hymns or legal codes. He's telling the Epic of Gilgamesh, Specifically, he's at the part where the wild man Enkidu is introduced. And this is where the story of the temple prostitute gets a narrative glow-up, transforming from a confusing job description into a legitimate civilizing superpower. The priest tells the novices how the gods created Enkidu as a rival for the arrogant king Gilgamesh. Enkidu is pure nature, a wild man who lives in the wilderness with the animals. He's covered in hair, eats grass, and runs with the gazelles. He's a walking embodiment of chaos, a pre-civilized force of nature who keeps thwarting the local trappers by freeing animals from their snares. The trapper, completely fed up, goes to Gilgamesh for advice. Gilgamesh, in a moment of what is either genius-level HR management or just peak ancient world problem-solving, gives him a brilliant and bizarre plan. He tells the trapper, "Go and bring with you a harem too, a woman from the temple of Ishtar. When the wild man comes to the watering hole with his herd, she must reveal her beauty. He will see her and embrace her. Then his herd, the animals who grew up with him, will reject him." So the trapper goes and gets a woman named Shamhat. It's a mainstream historical fact that this episode from the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of our most detailed literary sources for understanding the role of these temple women. The name Shamhat is derived from a word meaning voluptuous or beautiful. She's not just any woman. She is a representative of the goddess of love, a vessel of urban, sophisticated sensuality. The priest's voice drops as he describes the scene. Shamhat and the trapper wait by the watering hole. Enkidu appears, shaggy and magnificent. Shamhat, without any hesitation, does precisely what Gilgamesh suggested. She opens her robes. Enkidu, who has never seen a human woman before, is utterly captivated. The epic says, "For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu was aroused and flowed into Shamhat." Let's gloss over the divine stamina involved here and focus on the result. After his week-long cultural exchange program, Enkidu has changed. He gets up to rejoin his animal friends, but the gazelles see him and run away. The wild beasts of the steppe now reject him. His body has been weakened. He can no longer run as fast as they do. But his mind has been opened. He has gained wisdom and understanding. Shamhat then takes him by the hand and leads him towards civilization. She gives him some of her own clothes. She teaches him how to eat bread and drink beer, the two great pillars of Mesopotamian society. He goes from chewing grass to appreciating a good craft brew. This is a quirky and wonderful tidbit. His transformation into a human is marked by his adoption of a processed carb diet. Civilization, in the Sumerian view, is beer. Shamhat essentially tames the wild man not through violence or force, but with snacks, beer, and the power of human connection. She is the catalyst for his entire journey, the bridge between the wild and the city, between nature and culture. This right here is the crux of the entire scholarly debate, viewed through a literary lens. Historians still argue whether Shamhat should be seen as a prostitute in the modern commercial sense, or as something far more profound. Was she a simple harlot, a honey trap sent to ensnare a noble savage? Or was she a sacred agent of the goddess, a priestess whose sexuality was a tool of transformation, a holy power that could turn a beast into a man? The text itself treats her with immense respect. She is never shamed or looked down upon. She is wise, patient, and pivotal to the entire epic. Enkidu, far from resenting her for taking him from the wild, blesses her later in the story, saying that kings and nobles will desire her and shower her with riches. Mocking this particular debate feels wrong because it's about so much more than just a word. How you interpret Shamhat changes the story's meaning entirely. If she's just a prostitute, the story is a cynical tale of seduction and entrapment. But if she's a sacred officiant, it's a profound myth about the civilizing power of love, culture, and human society, represented by the temple and its goddess. She isn't selling a product, she's performing an initiation ritual. She's not just taming a wild man, she's birthing a human soul. The old priest finishes his story, his eyes twinkling. The novices are rapt, their faces complete with wonder. They're not just learning a story, they're absorbing a worldview. They're learning that the forces represented by the Temple of Inanna are not just about fertility and bookkeeping. They are the very essence of what it means to be human. The power of these women, the priest implies, is the power to create society itself, one wild man at a time. You look at the female temple workers moving through the courtyard and see them in a new light. They are all, in a way, daughters of Shamhat. They are the keepers of a power that can build cities, create kings, and turn monsters into men, all by offering them a beer and a little bit of understanding. The story of Shamhat and Enkidu is still swirling in your head, making you reconsider everything you thought you knew. This temple, this whole culture, is built on a foundation of, well, complicated female power. And if you want to understand the priestesses, the accountants, the sacred brides, and the civilizing agents, you have to understand their boss. You have to understand the goddess they all serve, Inanna. And she is not your sweet, gentle, Earth Mother next door type of deity. She is the original chaotic neutral goddess, and trying to pin her down is like nailing jello to a wall during an earthquake. You wander into a part of the temple that feels more like a museum or a shrine. The walls are covered in carved stone reliefs depicting scenes from the goddess's life, and it's a wild ride. Inanna, or Ishtar as she was later known, was the Sumerian goddess of a seemingly contradictory portfolio of cosmic responsibilities. She was the goddess of love, beauty, and sensuality, but she was also the goddess of war, conflict, and political power. She was the morning star, bringing light and love, and the evening star, bringing darkness and battle. She wasn't a goddess of peaceful, domestic love. She was the goddess of passionate, obsessive, often destructive desire. She wasn't a goddess of honorable, defensive war. She was the goddess of the sheer, brutal joy of the fight. This divine paradox is a mainstream historical fact, and it's the key to understanding her entire personality. She contained multitudes, and most of them were armed and dangerous. You look at one of the reliefs. It shows Inanna standing on the back of a lion, her personal sigil, holding weapons, with rays of light or power emanating from her shoulders. She looks fierce, confident, and utterly in charge. She was never depicted as a demure, subordinate wife goddess. In the myths, she is the one who chooses her lovers, and she is the one who discards them. She is ambitious, cunning, and notoriously short-tempered. She is, to put it in modern terms, a drama queen of cosmic proportions, and you are living in her divine reality show. You move to the next carving, which depicts a scene from one of her most famous myths. This one tells the story of how she acquired her power. In the beginning, the story goes, she didn't have all that much divine clout. The significant portfolios, wisdom, magic, kingship, the art of beer making, were all held by the god of wisdom, Enki. So what does Inanna do? Does she work hard and prove her worth over millennia? No. She decides to get the god of wisdom blackout drunk and steal his stuff. This is a genuinely quirky and hilarious tidbit from Sumerian mythology. The myth Inanna and Enki describes her journey to the city of Eridu to visit Enki. He, delighted to see the beautiful young goddess, throws a massive party. They have a drinking contest. As Enki gets progressively more hammered on beer, his judgment evaporates. In a fit of drunken generosity, he starts gifting Inanna the divine decrees, the fundamental powers of civilization. He gives her kingship, the scribal art, priesthood, sexual intercourse, prostitution, there's that word again, truth, and about 100 other things, right down to the art of the leatherworker. She accepts them all, loads them onto her boat while he's passed out, and sails back to her own city, Uruk. When Enki sobers up, he has the world's worst hangover and a sudden realization. Wait, where are all my divine powers? He sends a series of demons and monsters to chase her and get the me back. But she outwits them all and arrives in Uruk victorious, bringing civilization with her. The story is a masterpiece of divine comedy, portraying Inanna as a clever, ambitious, and slightly criminal goddess who literally founded her city's greatness on the proceeds of a drunken heist. This myth tells you everything you need to know about her and about the people who worshipped her. They didn't see her actions as immoral. They saw them as proof of her cleverness, her ambition, her right to rule. She was a goddess who got things done, even if it meant playing dirty. She embodies a force that is creative and destructive, loving and warlike, all at once. And this central paradox is what fuels the endless scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Inanna represents a holdover from a pre-patriarchal era when female deities held more power, or if her character is a complex reflection of the precarious nature of Sumerian life itself. Was her worship a form of female empowerment in a society that was, in many other ways, deeply patriarchal? Or was she a divine cautionary tale, a representation of the dangerous, untamable chaos that masculine order, represented by the king, had to ritually control and appease through things like the sacred marriage rite? Was she a feminist icon or a cosmic femme fatale? The answer is probably a messy, complicated, and deeply unsatisfying yes. Scholars love to debate this because Inanna refuses to fit into any of their neat little boxes. She's too loud, too ambitious, too sexual, and too violent. She's a theological problem child. You look around the shrine, at the depictions of this glorious, terrifying, beer-swindling goddess of everything necessary, and you finally get it. You understand why her priestesses couldn't just be one thing. They couldn't be just nuns or just prostitutes or just accountants. To serve a goddess who was the patron of both the bedroom and the battlefield, who invented civilization by outdrinking the god of wisdom, you had to be a multitasker. You had to be able to manage a contract, bless a king, compose a love poem, and maybe, just maybe, be ready to stand on a lion and fight a demigod if the situation called for it. Serving Inanna wasn't a job. It was a way of life, and it was never, ever dull. Your head is swimming with tales of divine heists and chaotic goddesses. You feel like you've just taken a masterclass in ancient theology, and it's left you needing a very stiff, gritty Sumerian beer. You wander out of Inanna's shrine, seeking a bit of fresh air, and stumble into a courtyard that smells meaty. Not the pleasant smell of a barbecue, but the coppery, visceral smell of a butcher's shop. And goats. A lot of very nervous-looking goats are tethered to a post, bleating anxiously. You found the temple's divination department, and you've arrived just in time for a professional consultation. A wealthy merchant, dripping with anxiety and expensive jewelry, is talking in hushed, urgent tones to a priest. This isn't just any priest. This is a baru, a specialist in divination. His job is to be the god's middleman, the divine tech support who can read the universe's error messages. The merchant is clearly worried about a big shipment of cedarwood he's expecting. Will the boat sink? Will pirates attack? Will the market price collapse? He needs answers, and he's willing to pay top goat to get them. The baru priest nods sagely, his face a mask of professional calm. He selects one of the goats, a particularly handsome one that looks like it was just starting to get its life together, and his assistants lead it to a low brick altar. With a swift, practiced movement, they perform the sacrifice. It's not a frenzied, dramatic scene. It's precise, clinical, and a little bit sad. The goat didn't even see it coming. This right here is a mainstream historical fact. Divination was a highly respected and essential science in Mesopotamia. Kings wouldn't go to war, merchants wouldn't launch a venture, and people wouldn't build a house without first consulting a diviner to see if the omens were favorable. It was the ancient world's equivalent of running a market analysis, a credit check, and a weather forecast all at once. Now for the gross part. The priest doesn't just look at the sky or consult some holy book. His diagnostic tool is the goat's internal organs. He makes a careful incision and removes the liver, holding it up to the light. The liver was considered the seat of life and emotion, and therefore the primary organ through which the gods would write their messages. The priest examines it with the intensity of a surgeon reading an MRI. He's looking for abnormalities, discolorations, and strange markings on the different lobes and ducts. Every tiny feature has a meaning. A swollen gallbladder? Your business partner is cheating you. An unusually long hepatic duct? Your journey will be successful. A mark shaped like a weapon? An enemy attack is imminent. To help him with this, the priest has a reference guide. This is the wonderfully quirky and macabre tidbit of the day. Archaeologists have found hundreds of clay models of sheep and goat livers, completely covered in cuneiform inscriptions. These were the textbooks and training manuals for apprentice diviners. They are like 3D anatomical charts from the world's goriest medical school. Each section of the clay liver is labeled with the omens associated with the feature at that spot. One famous model from the city of Mari is a veritable encyclopedia of doom, with inscriptions like, "If the path is forked, the campaign of the king will not be successful," and "Marking of an enemy army which will be made prisoner." They had a detailed, systematic, and utterly bizarre science of predicting the future by reading goat guts. They called it hepatoscopy, and it was big, big business. You watch, morbidly fascinated, as the priest traces a line on the real liver with his finger, then consults an assistant holding one of these clay models. They have a quiet, technical discussion, pointing and murmuring. It's not mystical, it's methodical. They're cross-referencing their data. The merchant wrings his hands, his face pale. His entire fortune is hanging in the state of a goat's biliary tract. And, of course, this being ancient Mesopotamia, the whole practice is a hotbed of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the diviners truly believed they were reading divine messages, or if they were shrewd political advisors using a cloak of religious authority to give advice they would have given anyway. Was the priest who told the king, "The liver omen foretells disaster if you attack the Elamites now," genuinely interpreting a divine warning? Or was he a clever military strategist who knew the army wasn't ready and used the only language the king would listen to? Was it genuine faith, or was it a form of psychological manipulation and political theater? A way to create consensus and justify difficult decisions by blaming them on the gods and a dodgy-looking goat liver? The line between religion and realpolitik is, as always, impossibly blurry. Mocking the debate seems cruel when you're watching entrails decide a man's financial future. It's like laughing at someone who just paid a fortune for a stock tip from a psychic who consults a magic 8-ball. Except in this case, the magic 8-ball is a bloody organ. The priest finally finishes his examination. He wipes his hands, turns to the merchant, and gives a slight, reassuring nod. "The goddess is favorable," he announces. "The palace gate is firm, and the weapon marking is turned away from your house. Proceed with the venture." The merchant almost collapses with relief. He bows deeply, showers the priest with thanks, and probably a massive bag of silver, and hurries away, his step now light and confident. The assistants clear away the goat's remains, which will now be used as food for the temple staff. Nothing is wasted. You are left staring at the altar, a sticky patch on the bricks, the only evidence of the cosmic consultation. You've just witnessed the Sumerian version of a high-stakes business meeting. It involved less PowerPoint and more viscera, but the underlying anxiety was the same. And you make a mental note. Never, ever get into a business that depends on the mood of a goat's liver. The whole goat gut reading spectacle has left you feeling a bit shaky. You need to see something solid, something grounded, something that doesn't involve predicting the stock market with internal organs. You find your way to what looks like a courthouse or a hall of records. Here, the scribes aren't tallying barley or copying myths. They're engraving laws onto massive stone pillars and recording legal contracts on small, pillow-shaped tablets. This is the temple's legal department, where divine will is translated into cold, hard, legally binding cuneiform. And it's here that the complicated lives of the temple women, especially the priestesses, snap into sharp, often brutal focus. You see a replica of a great stele, a tall, black stone, covered from top to bottom with dense rows of text. It's a copy of one of the famous Mesopotamian law codes, like the Code of Uarnamu or the later, more famous Code of Hammurabi. A mainstream historical fact is that these were some of the world's first comprehensive legal systems. They weren't just a list of thou shalt nots. They were detailed regulations covering everything from property rights and trade agreements to marriage, divorce, and personal injury. They were an attempt to create a society governed by predictable rules, not just the whims of the powerful. And they have a lot to say about women. You lean in, pretending to study the carvings, and you start to piece together the legal framework that governed the lives of the women you've seen. The laws paint a picture of a society that was deeply patriarchal but also surprisingly pragmatic. On one hand, women were largely considered the property of their fathers or husbands. Adultery by a wife was a capital crime, often punished by being thrown into the river. A man, however, could have multiple wives, concubines, and slave girls with few legal repercussions. The system was engineered to ensure one thing above all: the clear, undisputed paternity of heirs, so that property could be passed down the male line without any drama. But then you get to the sections about the temple women, and the rules get weird and specific. You find laws about the Nada priestesses, those celibate businesswomen you learned about earlier. The code states that a Nada priestess can inherit property from her father, just as her brothers do. She can run her own business, lend grain at interest, and own her own house and enslaved people. She was a legally recognized, economically independent agent. In a world where most women were lawfully attached to a man, these priestesses were a startling exception. They had sacrificed their ability to have children, and in exchange, the law granted them a level of economic freedom that was unheard of for their secular sisters. They were powerful landowners one day, making shrewd investments and expanding their portfolios. Then you read the following line, and you see the other side of the coin. The very same law code specifies what happens if a Nada priestess is seen entering a tavern. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky and specific legal tidbit. Law number 110 of Hammurabi's code states, if a sister of a god, a priestess, who is not living in a cloister opens a tavern or enters a tavern for a drink, they shall burn that woman. Let that sink in. She could own half the farmland in the district, but if she got caught having a casual beer at the local pub, the punishment was death by fire. The law held her to a higher, and frankly terrifying, standard of public decorum. Her sacred status was a golden cage. It gave her economic power, but it stripped her of personal freedom. She was a pillar of the community one moment, and a potential bonfire the next. This stark contrast highlights the central debate that rages among historians and legal scholars. Historians still argue whether these law codes were a genuine step forward for justice and social order, or merely a tool for reinforcing the existing power structure of the king, the temple, and male elites. Were they a blueprint for a just society, or a brutal instrument of social control? Did they protect the vulnerable by setting clear rules, or did they codify existing inequalities in stone? Looking at the law about the tavern-going priestess, the answer seems to be, why not both? The law protects her property rights with one hand and threatens to set her on fire for having a drink with the other. It's a legal system full of contradictions, a place where a woman could be a respected capitalist and a social outcast, all at the same time. You watch as two parties come before a panel of priests serving as judges. A man is arguing with a Nada priestess over a disputed field boundary. He is loud and aggressive, waving his arms. She is calm and composed, holding up a clay tablet, a deed, written and sealed, that clearly outlines her ownership. The priest judges examine the tablet, confer for a moment, and rule in her favor. The man storms off, muttering curses. The priestess bows her head respectfully, collects her tablet, and walks away with the quiet confidence of someone who knows the law and the gods are on her side. But then you see another woman being dragged before the judges. She's not a priestess. She's a weaver from the temple workshops, accused of stealing a small amount of wool. Her eyes are wide with terror. She has no tablet, no deed, no legal standing of her own. Her fate is entirely in the hands of the judges. You don't stay to watch the verdict. The Hall of Laws, which at first seemed like a beacon of order, now feels like a place of precarious, arbitrary power. The law can be your shield, or it can be the hammer that crushes you. For the women of the temple, their status, their property, and their very lives depended on which side of that divine and unforgiving line they happened to be standing on. You've seen the high drama of Sumerian temple life, the divine weddings, the goat gut prophecies, the life or death legal battles. It's all very epic. But what about the day-to-day? What was life actually like for the average temple worker when she wasn't busy embodying a goddess or being threatened with immolation for wanting a beer? You leave the intimidating Hall of Laws and follow a group of lower-ranking priestesses and female attendants into the workshops you passed earlier. This is the divine 9-to-5 grind, and it's a lot less glamorous than the myths would have you believe. The largest workshop is a cavernous hall filled with dozens of looms. The air is thick with the smell of lanolin and the endless, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of wooden shuttles passing back and forth. Women of all ages are here, their fingers flying as they weave intricate patterns into woolen and linen cloth. This is the temple's textile factory, a massive operation. A mainstream historical fact is that textiles were one of Mesopotamia's most important industries and a significant export. The intricate, high-quality cloth produced in temple workshops was famous across the ancient world. These women weren't just making clothes for the priests and the statues of the gods. They were producing a valuable commodity that filled the temple's treasury. You watch them work. It's monotonous, back-breaking labor. The women sit on the floor or on low benches for hours, their posture strained, their focus absolute. A single, complex piece of cloth could take weeks or even months to complete. Overseers, older priestesses with sharp eyes, patrol the aisles, checking the quality of the work, pointing out mistakes, and making notes on, you guessed it, clay tablets. Production quotas were a real thing. The gods demanded a certain number of new robes for the festival, and the merchants needed a certain number of bolts for the next caravan to Dilmun. The pressure was constant. Forget the sacred rites. For most of these women, their daily religious devotion was expressed through thread count and consistent selvage edges. In another part of the workshop, younger girls are doing the tedious preparatory work, cleaning the raw wool, combing it, and spinning it into thread using clay spindle whirls. Their hands are raw and chapped. They chant in unison as they work, not the beautiful, complex hymns of the high priestesses, but simple, repetitive work songs to keep the rhythm and pass the grueling hours. It's a holy assembly line. And then there's the beer. You thought the brewery was just for making ritual beverages and liquid salaries? Oh no. It was also the source of one of the temple workers' biggest daily complaints. This is a quirky and delightful tidbit we get from the cuneiform record itself. We have actual written complaints from temple weavers about the quality of their beer rations. One tablet from the city of Lagash records the gripes of a group of female weavers addressed to their overseer. They complain that their beer is watery, old, and not up to the quality they were promised for their work. It is the world's first ever formal complaint to HR about the terrible coffee in the break room. It's a wonderfully humanizing detail. Amidst all the gods and rituals, these women were still concerned with getting a decent drink at the end of a long, hard day of weaving for the goddess. The daily grind wasn't just physical labor. There was also the endless cycle of ritual maintenance. You see priestesses meticulously cleaning the sacred statues of the gods. They aren't just dusting. They are performing a ritual called the mizpai, or the washing of the mouth. They bathe the statues, anoint them with perfumed oils, and dress them in the fine clothes woven in the workshops. They serve them 2 meals a day, setting out plates of bread, meat, fruit, and beer before the divine images, which the gods would then spiritually consume. Afterward, the food was redistributed to the temple staff. It was like being the personal butler, chef, and stylist for a whole pantheon of very demanding, nonverbal rock stars. So, what was the real lived experience of these women? Historians still argue whether the temple provided a sanctuary for women, offering them a life of relative security and purpose outside the confines of marriage and childbearing, or if it was just another form of exploitation. In this holy sweatshop, women's labor was extracted for the benefit of the state. Was it a career path or a cage? Was a weaver who received food, shelter, and a possibly terrible beer ration from the temple better off than a farmer's wife who was subject to the whims of her husband and the constant threat of famine? The answer is incredibly complex and varies widely depending on a woman's rank, skills, and the specific temple she served. There was no single life of a priestess. There was a whole hierarchy, from the royal daughter who served as high priestess down to the indentured servant grinding grain in the flour mill. You watch an older priestess teaching a group of novices a long, complicated chant. It's one of the hymns to Inanna, a list of her many names and titles. The girls struggle to remember the unfamiliar words and the complex melody. The teacher is patient but firm. This is their education. They are learning the liturgy, the rituals, the stories that hold their world together. For them, this is the core of their existence. Their life is a repeating cycle of chanting, weaving, brewing, and serving. It lacks the high drama of a royal ritual, but it has a rhythm and a purpose of its own. It's a life of devotion, yes, but it is also fundamentally a job. And like any job, some days are better than others, and you pray that today is not the day they serve the bad beer. You're starting to feel like you've got a pretty good, if slightly weird, picture of Sumerian temple life. It's a world of bureaucracy, beer, and a touch of divine madness. You understand the complex roles of the priestesses, the temple's economic power, and the sheer strangeness of their religious beliefs. You think you're on solid, historical ground. And that's when you stumble out of the mundane world of the weaving workshops and into the temple's fringe theory corner. Because for every serious scholar meticulously translating cuneiform receipts for goats, there are 10 people on the internet absolutely convinced that the Sumerians were taught to write by aliens from the planet Nibiru. You haven't physically moved, but the vibe in the air has changed. You've left the well-lit halls of peer-reviewed history and wandered into a dusty, dimly lit chamber filled with scrolls of pure, uncut speculation. This is where mainstream historical facts get twisted into pretzel-like absurdity. A mainstream fact, for instance, is that the Sumerians had an incredibly advanced understanding of astronomy for their time. They mapped the constellations, tracked the movements of the planets, which they saw as gods, and developed a sophisticated calendar based on the moon cycles. They laid the foundations for all of Western astronomy. But according to some creative interpreters, they didn't figure this out on their own. Oh no, that would be ridiculous. Clearly, they were given this knowledge by extraterrestrial visitors. This is the cornerstone of the ancient astronaut theory, popularized in the 20th century by authors like Erich von Daniken and Zecharia Sitchin. They looked at the Sumerian myths, with their gods who fly through the sky in celestial boats and possess immense powers, and decided these weren't gods at all. They were the Anunnaki, a race of aliens who came to Earth to mine gold. The theory goes that these aliens needed a workforce, so they genetically engineered primitive hominids to create Homo sapiens, that's us, to serve as their slaves. The temples, in this view, weren't houses of worship. They were alien command centers, landing pads, and gold processing facilities. The ziggurat wasn't an artificial mountain to reach the gods. It was a literal launch tower. It's a wild, compelling story that makes for great late-night TV documentaries, and it's built on a foundation of spectacular misinterpretations. For a quirky and facepalm-worthy tidbit, take the Sumerian word dinger. In cuneiform, it's represented by a star-like symbol, and it's the determinative used before the name of any god. A mainstream scholar will tell you it means god or divinity. An ancient astronaut theorist will tell you it means the righteous ones of the rockets. They see cylinder seals depicting figures with wings and decide they're images of space-suited aliens, not symbolic representations of deities or spirits. They read myths about Inanna descending into the underworld and stripping off her regalia at 7 gates. They see an allegorical description of an astronaut passing through 7 atmospheric layers and removing pieces of her spacesuit. This is not a view shared by actual Sumerologists. The scholarly community's reaction to these theories ranges from quiet, weary sighs to explosive, table-flipping rage. Historians still argue whether these fringe theories are a harmless and entertaining form of pop culture mythology or a genuinely harmful phenomenon that dismisses the incredible intellectual achievements of ancient peoples. Does it matter if someone thinks a ziggurat is a spaceship? On one hand, who cares? It's fun to think about. On the other hand, the underlying assumption of the ancient astronaut theory is deeply problematic. The idea that ancient, non-Western people couldn't possibly have developed complex mathematics, astronomy, and architecture on their own. It subtly implies that they needed help from a more advanced, and often implicitly white-coated race of space people. It's a form of high-tech colonialism, robbing ancient cultures of their own genius. The debate is fierce. Mainstream archaeologists point to the clear developmental record, the slow evolution of cuneiform from pictographs, the gradual changes in pottery styles, the layers of construction on the temples, as definitive proof of a homegrown civilization. The fringe theorists dismiss this as a cover-up, evidence that mainstream science is hiding the truth. Mocking this debate is like shooting fish in a barrel with a rocket launcher. You have one side with mountains of physical evidence, linguistic analysis, and decades of peer-reviewed research, and the other side with a guy on YouTube pointing at a blurry carving and yelling. See? That's a laser gun. It doesn't stop with aliens. There are theories that the Sumerians were the survivors of Atlantis, bringing their advanced knowledge with them from a sunken continent. Some believe the Epic of Gilgamesh is a coded account of a nuclear war. And yes, the temple priestesses get a starring role in these rewrites of history. They weren't just priestesses. They were alien-human hybrids, tasked with passing on the extraterrestrial bloodline. The sacred marriage rite wasn't a fertility ritual. It was a genetic engineering program. You shake your head, trying to clear it of rocket ships and lizard people. It's a testament to the power and mystery of Sumer that it can inspire both rigorous academic study and such wild, unrestrained fantasy. The culture is so old, so foundational, and in many ways so alien to us that it becomes a kind of Rorschach test. Some people see the birth of bureaucracy and law. Others see the blueprints for a spaceship. As you step out of the imaginary fringe theory chamber and back into the sun-baked reality of the temple courtyard, you feel a new appreciation for the real story. It might not have aliens, but the truth, with its powerful priestesses, drunken gods, and goat-gut prophecies, is, in its own way, a whole lot weirder. The afternoon sun is starting to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the courtyards of Uruk. The heat is finally breaking, but there's a new kind of chill in the air, a sense of endings. You've been so immersed in this vibrant, chaotic world that it feels permanent, eternal. But it wasn't. You're standing in the heart of a civilization that is, from your future perspective, already a ghost. And the sacred rites you've witnessed, the complex roles of the temple women, the entire worldview built around goddesses like Inanna, it's all living on borrowed time. The gods are, eventually, going to leave the building. The decline was slow, a gradual erosion over centuries, not a single dramatic event. It's a mainstream historical fact that Sumerian culture was eventually absorbed by a succession of peoples. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and, finally, the Persians. Each new wave of conquerors brought their own gods, languages, and ideas about how society should be run. Inanna didn't disappear overnight. She syncretized, merging with the Akkadian Ishtar, the Canaanite Astarte, and the Greek Aphrodite. But with each transformation, something was lost. Her warrior aspect was often downplayed, her raw ambition softened. The chaotic, beer-stealing goddess of Uruk was slowly domesticated into a more palatable, predictable goddess of love. The temples remained powerful for a long time, but their central role as the state's all-encompassing heart began to fade. Kings began building massive palaces for themselves, separate from the temple complexes, creating a secular power base that rivaled the authority of the priests. The law codes began to be issued by the king's authority, not the gods. The delicate, intertwined dance of church and state was turning into a divorce. As you walk through the Inanna precinct, you can almost feel the future creeping in. The rituals feel hollow, and the chants are less confident. This is where a quirky and poignant tidbit of archaeology comes in. In later periods of Mesopotamian history, we begin to find school texts in which scribes copy the old Sumerian myths and hymns. But Sumerian had become a dead language like Latin in the Middle Ages. The scribes were learning it as a classical language, often with interlinear translations into their own Akkadian dialect. They were studying their own history as a relic. They were tourists in their own past, meticulously preserving rituals and stories whose original context and spirit were already slipping away. Imagine a priest in Rome trying to perform a ceremony by reading a Latin text he doesn't fully understand. That was the eventual fate of the rites of Inanna. The role of the high priestesses also changed. While they remained important, their economic independence was gradually curtailed. New legal and social structures, more rigidly patriarchal, began to take hold. The unique space that women like the Natatu had carved out for themselves began to shrink. The idea of a powerful, celibate female landowner became more of an anomaly, a relic of a bygone age. And this leads to one of the most significant and sorrowful debates among historians. Historians still argue whether the decline of these sacred female-centric rites was simply a natural cultural evolution or the result of a deliberate campaign of suppression by new, male-dominated religions. Was the gradual disappearance of goddesses like Inanna from the top tier of the pantheon an organic shift in religious sentiment? Or was it a targeted demotion, a theological coup d'état by the priests of rising male storm gods like Marduk of Babylon and Ashur of Assyria, who rewrote the creation myths to place their chosen deity at the center of the cosmos? Mocking this debate feels particularly cheap, given the profound consequences. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The complex, powerful, and sometimes sexual aspects of the divine feminine that Inanna embodied were increasingly viewed with suspicion. They were censored, written out of the new myths, or demonized. The sacred prostitute, whether she was ever a real thing or just a slanderous rumor, became the only part of the story that survived, precisely because it was so easy to condemn. Later monotheistic religions, rising in the West, needed a clear line between the sacred and the profane, the spirit and the flesh. There was no room in their tidy theology for a goddess who loved both prayer and parties. The Temple of Inanna, once the center of the world, became the archetypal den of sin. The sacred harlot of Babylon in the Book of Revelation is the final, twisted echo of the powerful priestesses of Uruk. She is Inanna's ghost, stripped of all her power and dignity, and turned into a symbol of everything that must be destroyed. You look up at the great ziggurat, its edges blurring in the twilight. The last rays of the sun paint the mud bricks in shades of orange and purple. For a moment, it's alive again, bustling with the ghosts of priests and scribes and weavers. But it's just a trick of the light. The silence that follows is profound. The chants have faded. The looms are still. The divine spreadsheets have been filed away for the last time. The gods have left, and they've taken their complicated, brilliant, and terrifying world with them, leaving behind only misunderstood ruins and a legacy that was about to get a very, very bad rap. The twilight deepens, and the ghosts of Uruk recede into the dust. Your journey through the Sumerian temple is over. You've survived the bureaucracy, the bad beer, and the theological whiplash. But as you turn to leave, you realize the story isn't finished. The priestesses of Inanna might have vanished 4,000 years ago, but their memory, twisted and mutated, has haunted the world ever since. The misunderstood sacred harlot didn't die. She just went freelance. She became a pop culture trope, an archetype that has endured for millennia, influencing everything from the Bible to video games. You're now fast-forwarding through time, watching the ripple effects of this one misunderstood role spread through history. It starts with the Bible. The prophets of ancient Israel were locked in a fierce ideological battle with the surrounding polytheistic cultures of Canaan, whose religions shared many features with those of Mesopotamia. A mainstream historical fact is that the Bible is filled with condemnations of sacred prostitution and cultic harlots associated with the worship of foreign gods like Baal and Astarte, Inanna's direct descendant. The biblical authors used the figure of the harlot as a powerful metaphor for religious infidelity. To worship other gods was to go a-whoring after them. The entire city of Babylon, the heir to Sumerian culture, becomes the whore of Babylon, a symbol of decadent, idolatrous evil. The complex priestess of Inanna, who once embodied the sacred power of civilization, is now the poster child for everything godly people must reject. Her multifaceted character has been flattened into a single damning label. This image, seared into the Western consciousness by the Bible, becomes a self-perpetuating myth. For centuries, any evidence of powerful or sexual women in ancient religion was viewed through this lens. The Vestal Virgins of Rome? Secretly promiscuous. The priestesses of Isis in Egypt? Obviously running a cult of sacred sex. The female followers of Dionysus in Greece? Wild, orgiastic maenads. The archetype of the pagan priestess, as a sexually deviant figure, became a convenient way to dismiss and demonize pre-Christian religions, portraying them as morally bankrupt and justifying their destruction. The ghost of Herodotus's single, unverified story was working overtime, providing the perfect bogeyman for a new religious world order. And here's a quirky, modern tidbit for you. The trope is still alive and well, but it has shapeshifted. In the 19th and 20th centuries, with the rise of Romanticism and later fantasy fiction, the figure of the sacred prostitute got a makeover. She was no longer just a symbol of sin. She became the exotic, mysterious, and often tragic priestess of a lost world. Think of the beautiful, doomed priestesses in the pulp fiction of Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian, or the seductive sorceresses in countless fantasy novels. They are often portrayed as practitioners of ancient, sensual magic, guardians of forgotten lore, torn between their sacred duties and their forbidden love for the hero. Their sexuality still defines them, but now it's alluring and magical instead of purely sinful. It's a slightly more sympathetic portrayal, but it's still the same old trope in a new, sparkly outfit. And of course, this leads to a modern, ongoing scholarly debate. Historians, feminists, and even neo-pagan religious groups still argue over the legacy of the sacred harlot. Is it possible to reclaim this figure from centuries of slander and misinterpretation? Can we separate the historical reality of the Sumerian priestesses from the fictional trope they inspired? Some modern feminist scholars have tried to rehabilitate the sacred whore, seeing her as a symbol of empowered female sexuality. This pre-patriarchal icon celebrated the body and the divine feminine before monotheism suppressed it. Neo-pagan groups sometimes incorporate the idea of sacred sexuality into their own rituals, attempting to reconstruct what they believe was an ancient, earth-honoring practice. Other scholars push back, arguing that this romantic rehabilitation is just as historically inaccurate as the old condemnations. They say that by focusing on the sexual aspect, we are still falling into Herodotus's trap. We are ignoring the fact that these women were primarily accountants, landowners, poets, and politicians. To romanticize them as free-spirited sexual gurus is once again to erase their actual, documented economic and political power. It's a different kind of flattening, replacing the evil sinner with the magical sex priestess. But it's a flattening all the same. Mocking this debate is tough because it's not just about ancient history anymore. It's about modern identity, religion, and sexuality. It's about who gets to tell the story of these women and what we choose to remember about them. You see this trope everywhere now. She's the femme fatale in a noir film, using her seductive power to manipulate men. She's the hooker with a heart of gold in a Hollywood movie, a figure of worldly wisdom and surprising innocence. She's the scantily clad sorceress class in a fantasy MMORPG, wielding powerful magic that is somehow tied to her revealing armor. She is the ghost of Shamhat, the ghost of the high priestess of Inanna, stripped of her clay tablets and her land deeds, and left with only her sensuality. Her legacy is a 4,000-year-long game of telephone, where the original message, "I am a powerful agent of a complex divine and economic system," has been distorted into a whisper of scandal and fantasy. The forgotten secret of the Sumerian temple prostitutes is that they probably never even existed. But the idea of them has proven to be one of the most powerful and enduring stories we've ever told. And so, you step out of the gates of Uruk for the last time. The dust of the ancient city settles behind you, and the sounds of the modern world slowly fade back in. You've walked through the birth of civilization, a place of mind-bending contradictions. You've seen how writing was invented for bookkeeping, how society was civilized by beer and snacks, and how the fate of an empire could rest on the liver of an unlucky goat. You've met the powerful, brilliant, and deeply misunderstood women who ran the world's first divine corporation, only to have their legacy garbled into a slanderous, centuries-long rumor. You made it. You survived the sensory overload, the bureaucratic dread, and the existential vertigo of peering 5,000 years into the past. The world you're returning to has toilets, and for that you can be eternally grateful. But the ghosts of Sumer are sticky. Their story is now part of yours. The next time you see a spreadsheet, you might think of a cuneiform tablet. The next time you visit a politician making a grand promise, you might think of the sacred marriage rite. The next time you hear a story about a seductive, mysterious woman, you might see the faint outline of a priestess of Inanna, shaking her head and wishing everyone would remember her for her excellent land management skills. The journey is over. You can unclench your jaw. You can finally get that smell of goat and existential dread out of your tunic. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember, at least no one asked you to bless a goat today. Probably. Sweet dreams.